Thank you for joining us tonight for the Bilson Lecture. My name is Jeff Comfort. I'm the chair of the Research Committee in the Department of History at the University of Saskatchewan. The Bilson Lecture is held every 2 years to honor the late Professor Jeffrey Bilson, who taught at the University of Saskatchewan from 1964 to 1987. He was a specialist in American colonial history and Canadian medical history, who also wrote historical fiction for children. Tonight's event is supported by the Jeffrey Bilson Memorial Trust, the Department of History, and the Historical GIS Lab at the University of Saskatchewan. I'd like to thank Abhinav Bagram, who helped with the administrative preparations for tonight, and also for Jane Westhouse, who helped with the logistical arrangements. We're privileged to have with us tonight a real innovator in historical research, Dr. Kelly Knowles of Middlebury College, Vermont. Dr. Knowles has been a leader over the past 2 decades in bringing together the academic disciplines of history and geography. Trained as an historical geographer at the University of Wisconsin, she led something of a crusade to encourage historians to understand the past through a spatial lens, and to encourage geographers to grapple with places by engaging with their history. Beginning in the mid-1990s, just as Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, was evolving out of a highly specialized mainframe computing into a new consumer-friendly desktop application, Dr. Knowles began working to stimulate the cross-disciplinary research that linked historical scholarship and geographical inquiry in order to enrich both. GIS provided a tool that could bridge the 2 disciplines. As a leader of the Historical Geography Network and the Social Science History Association, Dr. Knowles, along with others, built a community of researchers interested in the potential of historical GIS research. In 2002, she edited Past Time, Past Place, GIS for History, the first book focused on historical GIS methods. In 2004, she organized a major international conference on historical GIS at the Newberry Library in Chicago, which led to a second book in 2008 called Placing History: How Maps, Spatial Data, and GIS Are Changing Historical Scholarship. Dr. Knowles has led by example, working with the U.S. National Park Service to create an historical GIS of the Gettysburg Civil War battlefield. She has worked with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to reveal the spatial components of the Holocaust. That work led to a brand new book just out a few weeks ago called Geographies of the Holocaust. And she recently published a beautiful book from the University of Chicago Press entitled Mastering Iron: The Struggle to Modernize an American Industry, that reinterprets the role of the emergent iron industry in America's 19th century industrialization. I'll mention that several of these books are available for perusal or for sale, and Dr. Knowles has offered to sign them after the talk tonight, if you'd like. In recognition of her important work in 2012, Dr. Knowles received the Smithsonian American Ingenuity Award for historical scholarship and was the focus of a featured article in Smithsonian Magazine. Over the years, she's received support for her work from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, the Newberry Library, the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, and the American Council of Learned Societies. In addition to being a model and an inspiration for my own scholarship, she's also become a good friend. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Kelly Knowles.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for coming. I've been telling people all day how pleased and excited I am to be here. Anytime I get within range of the Canadian border, I'm aware all over again of how little I know about Canada. My husband as the director of the Canadian American Center at the University of Maine in Orono reminds me of this routinely, so I'm glad to be able to fill in some gaps coming here. And I also want to let all of you know, in case there's anyone in the audience who doesn't know, that Jeff Kunfer, as the director of the Historical GIS Lab at the University of Saskatchewan, is a trailblazer. His was the first historical GIS lab in North America, and from what I see happening there right now, it is a dynamic place that's producing wonderful scholarship. So you're very lucky to have him, and I'm so happy to be able to visit. My title, Vision in History, refers to a theme that's developed in my scholarship over the last 10 years or more without my really intending it. It's kind of creeped in. Vision has influenced many important historical decisions, I think as far back as you want to look. Whether you think of vision literally, as what people could or could not see in a particular place at a particular time, or if you think of vision metaphorically, what people imagined or wanted or believed could happen. This evening I'd like to tell you about the crucial role that vision played at two junctures in American history. I'll show you first how antebellum entrepreneurs' vision of industrial greatness fell afoul of geographical realities. And secondly, I'll tell you how Confederate and Union commanders' views of the battlefield, their literal views, at Gettysburg may have shaped their command decisions. Both of these studies are based on the visual methodology that Jeff mentioned, GIS, Geographic Information Systems, which I'll explain a little bit as I go for those of you who are not familiar with how it works. Well, the notion that one could reconstruct what people could literally see in the past occurred to me about 15 years ago, I think, when I came across the work of an American historian named Mark Smith. His book in 1997 called Mastered by the Clock, Time, Slavery, and Freedom in the American South introduced me to something called sensory history. Sensory history basically involves researching the role of the senses, particularly hearing and sight, in shaping people's experiences in the past. It helps us understand at a deeply human and sometimes even instinctive level how they understood their places, which is part of what interests me as a geographer. And it's a field of study that historians at that time, not quite 20 years ago, were just beginning to think about. I can give you one example of sensory history that I just learned about at a workshop that I was involved in this summer. I met a medieval art historian from the University of Chicago named Neil Atkinson, who is digitally reconstructing the streetscape of 15th century Florence in order to study how the ringing of church bells helped demarcate religious neighborhoods. Even just thinking about that project sort of sets bells off in my mind. My first slide is from the Virtual Paul's Cross project at North Carolina State University, where scholars, including computer scientists and very gifted digital staff, have rendered the outdoor pulpit and courtyard in London next to St. Paul's Church, where John Donne delivered a politically important speech for Gunpowder Day on November 5, 1622. Historians know where certain people were standing that day. They mention it in letters or in their diaries. This simulated environment will now help historians better understand how well certain influential people may have been able to hear Donne's sermon, which, according to history, was not circulated at the time, so hearing it was important for getting the political message he was getting across. Well, as a geographer, I've always been interested in how landscape has influenced human history. I will turn to the role that sight played at Gettysburg in the second half of my talk. This is just a teaser. I think you may be more familiar with the other kind of vision in history. Vision in the sense of how people envisioned their circumstances and dreams. What people imagined or wanted to believe they could bring to pass. In the 1820s and 1830s, American industrialists were dreaming of places like this. This is a watercolor painting from 1824 of a town most North Americans are not familiar with because it doesn't mean much today. It's Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales. But in 1824, when this painting was done, it was the biggest center of iron making in the world. And I'm going to be talking a fair bit about this in comparison to what America had at that time. But I want to plant a general theme with you before I begin the story of American iron. We tend to laud pioneers as visionaries when they succeed. Those are the stories Disney makes movies about, the individual who overcomes all odds to pave the way for progress and social justice and so forth. We less often hear about the visionaries who fail. And my main story about the American iron industry is one of failure. So let me introduce the comparison between what was going on in Britain at the beginning of the 19th century, where iron was really, new iron-making processes were developed for large-scale iron production, and what was going on in the United States. So hold in your minds, if you would, this little image where in the foreground are rolling mills where things like railroad rails would eventually be produced, large finished products made of iron. And in the background in gray, you have a rank of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things called blast furnaces, which are great big stone constructions. These were about 70, 80 feet tall with a crucible in the middle of them. You put raw materials in the top, coal, iron ore, and limestone. You heat it up, you let it cook. The iron, being the heavy element, sinks to the bottom of that crucible and comes out as pig iron. By the way, it's called pig iron because it comes into a bed of sand, and the main channel where the iron flows first is the sow, and the little piglets are the little channels off the side in the sand that are small enough that a man can lift it. So pig iron is crude iron of a weight of no more than 150 or 200 pounds. 7 making 5,000 tons a week, compared to the American scenario at the same time. This, a blast furnace that runs on charcoal, not coal, and produces 5,000 to 10,000 pounds a year. This is the Warwick furnace in southeastern Pennsylvania, not far outside of Philadelphia, painted by Benjamin Latrobe, one of the men responsible for the National Road, but he also was a very fine artist. Now this painting illustrates the problem of American iron, very small scale, located in the midst of its fuel supply. We have environmental historians in the audience, so I can talk about fuel. You needed 5,000 to 10,000 acres of wooded land to feed a furnace like this with charcoal. So the furnaces, each little company making iron, is surrounded by its supply of forest. But this means it has to be in a rural setting. This means that you can't have a large community of workers. You have just a few workers living nearby. And because you're in the countryside and you're located near iron, which in the United States is mostly in the Appalachian mountain chain, you're very far away from Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, your big urban markets. So the geography of the American iron industry was a fundamental problem that people wanted to solve. People like this man. This is really the centerpiece, this man, the centerpiece of my book on the iron industry. His name was Peter Leslie. He was a very diligent man who made his living doing surveys for coal companies to help them find coal veins in Pennsylvania mostly. But he also was generally interested in industry. And in the 1850s, he became one of the founding members of an organization called the American Iron Association. This was an early trade group of industrial leaders, most of them on the East Coast, a lot of them in Pennsylvania, who wanted to improve the American industry to beat cheap British iron, which was imported at the ruin of American business, they thought. And they wanted America to fulfill its promise and supply its own industrial needs. This had been a dream of the founders in the colonial period even. Peter Leslie was unusual because he was extremely systematic. He was basically a mid-19th century data geek who thought that you could solve the problem of industrial backwardness and the lack of American-made domestic supply by surveying the industry, finding the best practitioners using the latest technology, which, by the way, was coming from South Wales, and just show everybody what the right model was, and they would adopt it, the industry would modernize, and things would flourish. To that end, he set out on a remarkable mission that ended up taking him 3 years and costing thousands of dollars out of his own pocket to create the book that's on your right, The Iron Manufacturer's Guide to the Furnaces, Forges, and Rolling Mills of the United States with discussions of iron. Don't you love the titles back then? It was published in 1858, just before the Civil War, which made it a crucial source for me to mine to understand the state of the industry leading up to the Civil War, where iron was a really big story, but you have to get the book to read that. Let me show you what's in this source, because it relates to my theme about the theme I'll be developing through the first part of this talk about what Americans knew and what they didn't know, what they dreamed of, what they envisioned, and what they failed to notice. This is probably the most boring book I've ever looked at in my life. It contains 752 pages, half of which look like this. This is a sample entry, an unusually complete and actually interesting entry on a single ironworks, and there are thousands of ironworks in this book. It's a compendium of the industry. And I'm going to deconstruct it for you in a moment. But what I want to pick out is what Peter said in a letter back home to his wife, Susan, about this particular place, the Lehigh Crane Iron Company. My study, this is a footnote, but it's crucial. I like to explain a little bit about what makes historical research possible and fun. The most fun part of my research on this book was discovering that Peter Leslie and the people he hired to work with him to gather the data on the iron industry were members of a family who had been writing one another. They had a family tradition of letter writing going back to 1750. And they kept all their letters. It was just something the Leslies did. And it ended up being the largest cache of personal family letters in the United States, about half of which belonged to a family in Boulder, Colorado, who let me come to their house and work in their basement to read Peter's letters back home to his wife while he was conducting the survey to gather this data. Here's what Peter wrote in a letter back to his wife about the Lehigh Crane Iron Company. He said, "We may cease to regret the absence of European castles from American routes of travel. High square chimneys of the Lehigh Crane Iron Works rise like the towers and turrets of Carnarvon Castle." This is an expression of vision that American industry was already becoming as great as the royal power in England. Carnarvon Castle is in Wales. He made that reference, I think, full knowing that they were trying to replicate the Welsh iron industry in Pennsylvania. And it was founded by an English king, Edward I. So he's dreaming really big. Now let me take you back to the source for a second, and here's where I'm going to show you a bit about how an historical scholar approaches GIS. This text contains what we call structured data, regular categories of information that you can extract relatively easily to put into a spreadsheet, which is the first step toward building a GIS. The second step is locating the places that you're learning about. So, who managed the works? When were they built? What technology did they use, which was crucial for me to see which works are using modern Welsh technologies, which are not. How much did they produce of what kind of iron? Where did they get their resources? And hey, bingo, a unique identifying number, which is what we had in GIS for everything, and a geographic location. In some cases, described down to the level of an address in Philadelphia, or it may say up the West Branch of the Susquehanna 3 miles beyond West Haven. But anyway, this makes it possible to map thousands of ironworks and produce maps. The most remarkable thing about GIS, for me, is the way it answers questions. When you ask a GIS system a question, you phrase a query that usually can return a map. How many systems are there where you ask a question and you get the map as an answer? For a geographer, this is fantastic. So this map is the result of a series of queries where I asked where were the ironworks located, and then were they urban, or in a village, or in a rural setting, which was another category I added to the database. I wanted to see where were the concentrations of production and so forth. So you can, with GIS, you can begin to interrogate the data in really rich ways. We call it iterative visualization, where you get one map and you, oh, that inspires new questions. So you phrase another query and get another map. And that was largely how I built my book. This is another example of the sort of analytical capacity of GIS. You may remember out of those various categories of information in the original source, it was how much iron did they produce. So you can query the database to ask how much iron was produced on average in a year in each of the databases. And what this map, as the answer picks out, is the tremendous, unsurprising dominance of Pennsylvania, and more generally the mid-Atlantic states, including northern New Jersey and Maryland and so forth, and the relative paucity of production in the South. This is the map I use in the book to set up the dire situation that the southern states, the Confederacy, faced going into the Civil War with so few producers on their home territory. And many of the producers were taken away from them, like in the Cumberland Valley in Kentucky and western Tennessee early in the war. So it was a real scramble throughout the Civil War for the South to produce their own iron. This is my map based again on that wonderful set of letters, hundreds of letters that these men exchanged as they were researching the industry and gathering the data for the guide. These were the journeys of a young Brahmin, a young man, Benjamin Smith Lyman, raised in Massachusetts, went to Harvard, attended lectures by Henry David Thoreau and Emerson at the Unitarian Church with his uncle Peter. These are highly educated, sophisticated people. And when he started going down into the deep South at his uncle's bidding, he was the youngest man, he got the sort of worst assignment. Here are the kinds of things he wrote back. Writing from what he called the outskirts of Pandemonium, and guess where that was? It wasn't Georgia. It was Stanton, Virginia. Northern Virginia. I expect to meet with a Spartan diet and freedom from luxury, but the Spartans, classical illusions, right, from the Harvard man. But the Spartan slaves were not waiting on you in nothing but a filthy shirt. Well, guess what? Benjamin Smith Lyman's disapproving view of Southern culture and Southern ironmasters did not endear him. The ironmasters of Richmond, Virginia declined to see him. That was the center of ironmaking in the South. Others in Georgia and Alabama unaccountably failed to meet him at the appointed time and place. He took their failure as a sign of their disregard for proper business procedures and basic etiquette. But to me, his Yankee prejudice became a key clue to a fundamental flaw in Northern industrialists' attitude toward modernization. To them, modern industry was all about the latest technology, good bookkeeping, and driving down prices to compete with cheap British imports. They had not begun to realize what it really took to produce iron on a massive scale. Let me tell you how they set themselves up for a fall. The first thing that was crucial to making large amounts of iron, as the British and the Welsh particularly knew, was proximity of resources. That is, that coal, iron ore, and limestone were close to each other. This is my map of those resources in Great Britain, and I've pulled out the detail so you can get a better look at South Wales, and I picked out Merthyr Tydfil as what they call at the head of the valleys in South Wales. The resource situation geologically in South Wales was as good as it could be anywhere on Earth because the coal and the iron ore and the limestone were sitting on top of each other like a layer cake. At most, they were a half a mile or a mile apart in South Wales. So you start digging for one and you hit the other. This creates tremendous efficiencies, as you can imagine. Secondly, that cache of natural resources, the coal and iron ore especially, were right on the doorstep of the Cardiff docks, one of the biggest industrial dock systems in Britain. And of course, in this period, in the early 19th century, water transport is the cheapest. This helps explain why iron made in South Wales was cheaper on the market in Philadelphia and New York than iron made in Richmond, Virginia, because it was so cheap to get it across the Atlantic Ocean. In Wales and all of these industrial areas in England and Scotland as well, you also had a residential workforce. You had surplus population living in very close proximity to the industrial works, so labor supply was not an issue. Large cities were developing like Merthyr Tydfil, and this may seem a small thing, but it became really clear in another set of letters that I studied that it really mattered to have an industrial work culture if you were an iron worker. It was really hard work, it was dangerous, it was hot and dirty, so what do you want to do at the end of the day? You want to go to the pub with your mates and have some pints. Well, in Merthyr Tydfil, there were, I don't know, 80 taverns. Right across the street from the ironworks that I studied particularly, there were 3 pubs. Well, in the middle of Pennsylvania, not so much. Especially if the owners of the company were teetotalers. And the other thing that was going on here, which this diagram picks out, this is based on an 1851 British Ordnance Survey map that we turned into a sort of spatial diagram. The other thing was integrated production. I showed with that Benjamin Latrobe painting a little tiny charcoal blast furnace surrounded by its forest. All of the refining, the final production of iron was done miles away from Warwick Furnace. That was the American model, distance between smelting and final production. But in Wales, it was all integrated. So just off of this map on your right-hand side are the mines and the quarries providing the raw materials, which come to those red footprints. Those are the blast furnaces where you get the iron out of the iron ore. Then it goes down a little train track, a little tram line to the rolling mills, comes out of the rolling mills, gets onto the canal, goes down to the Cardiff docks. So you have integrated production in Wales as early as 1800. Integrated production does not come to the United States until the Cambria mills and Johnstown and so forth get going in the 1850s. So this was a problem, a serious problem, that the Americans just didn't realize. And I have, by way of comparison, this map of the distance of materials. This is distance of pig iron down to one of the most successful antebellum ironworks, Trenton Ironworks in Newark, New Jersey. And you have dashed lines there at a circumference distance of 100 miles as the crow flies and then 200 miles as the crow flies. This company had to get its raw materials, pig iron, from as far as 250 miles away. And in Wales, it's a mile at most. So you see, with heavy industry, transport is the biggest cost. And so the cost comparisons are dreadful. So with that background, let me introduce you to the man who, as he wrote in his memoir, was deeply embarrassed by what happened to him. That's the word that people used in the early 19th century for economic disaster. This is Thomas Indasset Perkins. He began his career as an opium trader with Canton, China. Then he got into the fur trade and cornered the beaver market out of British Columbia. You see the beaver hat on the side and the Chinese jug. He decided in the 1830s, he was in Boston by the way, in the 1830s he wanted to diversify his portfolio and wanted to get into iron with some of his friends who were the wealthiest men in Boston. They're called the Boston Associates, the elite industrialists of Boston. And they had in their mind, their dream, as they wrote in a letter that became Choice for Me, they wanted to create the Merthyr Tydfil of America. So they wanted to replicate what I'm showing you here in central Pennsylvania. The little red sort of outline there is the property that they bought at a place called Farrensville in Lycoming County. Their goal was to get bituminous coal, not anthracite coal, which is in the dark gray areas labeled anthracite coal deposits, because anthracite coal is really hard to burn. But they wanted to get the nearest bituminous coal on the Schuylkill River and down the Susquehanna to get it to market in Philadelphia. So they were going to corner the coal market, they thought, and along the way they would make iron. To make iron, they hired this young man, Lieutenant Daniel Tyler, who's from a very good Connecticut Yankee family, went to West Point, went over to France being fluent in French, translated a French technical book that explained how to make iron. So he thought he knew how to make iron. He had read the handbook, he translated it, and he was great at the dinner parties that they had in Boston. When they hired him, he knew absolutely nothing. The company completely failed. They lost $500,000 between 1833 and 1838. That's an enormous catastrophe in that time. That's why Thomas and Dasset Perkins was deeply embarrassed and would say nothing about the venture in his memoir beyond that. How does one succeed in this period? Well, you deal with the wilderness. This is Carl Bodmer's painting of a place called Mauch Chunk, Pennsylvania, which was the first depot for anthracite coal coming down out of the mountains. You do not mess around with the landscape, you get to know it, you spend time there. And the two men who started the first successful iron company using anthracite, which was a particular technical challenge, had dealt with Mauch Chunk. They owned a big coal company there. They built the first gravity railway coming down to the Lehigh River. They built the first Lehigh Canal to get coal down to Pennsylvania, all this in the early 1830s. And by the time they decided to start making iron, they'd known this area like the back of their hands for almost a decade. They go to Wales personally rather than using a recruiting agent the way the Farrensville people did, and they hired this man. This is David Thomas, who had invented the process for making iron with anthracite coal in South Wales in 1838. In 1839, Erskine Hazard knocks on his door and says, "Mr. Thomas, we have a proposition for you." They brought him over first class passage with his family. They let him bring as many of his friends and relatives to work with him in Catasauqua, Pennsylvania, as he wished. Within 3 years, he had the company making a big profit. He eventually sets up his own ironworks in Tamaqua, where the Kunkers come from, and becomes one of the first industrial millionaires. What does this story tell us? Yes, technology was very important for making iron. I haven't begun to tell you how important it was. But what I've tried to emphasize is that many other things were important. The geography of resources, the cost of distance, the similarity of resources. In Farrensville in central Pennsylvania, the coal, what is the polite word I can use? The coal was crap. It was shale. It crumbled. It had very low caloric value in the furnace. It was full of dirt. It was really bad for making iron. But the Brahmins from Boston hadn't done any chemical assays. They didn't understand how bad it was. Whereas in southeast Pennsylvania, the anthracite is just like the anthracite in South Wales. It's an immediate success. They had a cohesive workforce at the Lehigh Crane Iron Company, where David Thomas brought in all of his friends and relatives. At Farrensville, they tried to mix Germans with Welsh. It was a disaster. And David Thomas was probably the most respected superintendent in the business in the world at the time that he came to the United States. So he brought a sort of gravitas and knowledge that was really crucial for being successful. Vision can go astray. Vision can cost you your reputation. Vision, if it isn't informed, particularly in the particularities of a place where you want to set up operation, can lead you terribly far off target. And the one connection to the present day that I was thinking about a lot as I was writing Master in Iron were the efforts at the time in the 1990s and the early 2000s to modernize business in the former Soviet Union, where there had been a culture of dependency and a state-run industry, and people used to working in a certain way, and all of a sudden, business was supposed to become modern and entrepreneurial and capitalistic, and it was a terrible struggle, which reminds me that culture is always a part of economy, culture is always a part of work relations, and we should keep those things in mind as every new wave of business comes through. Now to Gettysburg. I start the Gettysburg story with this image. It's a rare photograph, I don't think it's a daguerreotype, of General Grant, the great Union leader. All apologies to fans of the Confederacy for starting with this image. Reading a map. When I began working on Gettysburg, one of the first things I did was go to West Point and then to the National Archives in Washington to learn how commanders learned how to make decisions on the field. And one of the principles that I came away with, particularly from West Point officers, is the concept of reading the ground. That a commander has to read the ground quickly, often spur of the moment, to decide where to put their troops and how to organize an attack or a defense. Grant was famously good at doing this. Well, at Gettysburg, sight and those quick decisions of where to deploy troops, based largely on real-time vision, as we might say today, was particularly important. What I'm showing you here is the first known topographical map, that is a map of the landscape, the hills and valleys of Gettysburg. There's the town sort of in the upper part, and those squiggly looking hills are actually sort of drumlins and other glacial hills left behind from the last ice age. This map was drawn by Captain William Payne, who worked for the Federal Army, actually worked for General Meade, and he drew this map balancing a board on the pommel of his saddle the evening of the first day of battle, July 1st, 1863, because there was no topographical map of this area, only maps of roads and houses. One of the sort of ironies, geographically maybe, or cartographically of the Civil War, most battles took place in very long settled areas, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and even Georgia and so forth, South Carolina, where people had been living so long they didn't need detailed maps. They knew the roads, they knew how to get around. So this was an innovation. The reason that lack of a topographic map matters is that the armies converged on Gettysburg without any particular plan. Historians debate about how accidental it was, but it wasn't, there wasn't a plan on either side to have a battle at that place. So the commanders had to make quick decisions on the fly. Here's an aerial view from the early 20th century as the tourism industry was beginning to gear up at Gettysburg. But I like it because it gives a very nice sense of the terrain, which from here on I'm going to show you in other kinds of representations. There's Gettysburg in the sort of upper right, and the valley's coming down to a little round top at the bottom. Now, General Lee was also a very, very good reader of the ground. He had mapping experience. He was, of course, a tremendously successful Confederate commander for the first half of the Civil War. Before Gettysburg, he'd never lost a fight. So he's coming in, he's invading Pennsylvania to try to force Lincoln's hand to bring about a truce, and he also wants to humiliate Lincoln by having a battle close to Washington if he can, which is what Gettysburg becomes. Now, I found an extraordinary map in the National Archives at the beginning of my research. Here is a photographic copy of it from the original manuscript map from what's called the Vault of Treasures. It measures about 12 by 13 feet. Here I have students play acting. This is a map of the battlefield, which was compiled down to a poster size that looks like this. It is, I think, the most exquisite topographic map from the U.S. in the 19th century, a kind of cartographic memorial to the battle. It was surveyed, the ground was surveyed in 1867-68, and this map was produced in 1874. Here's some of the detail. And I ended up using this map as a source for creating a digital terrain of the ground to do a certain kind of analysis I'll explain in just a moment. But what was crucial for creating the historical terrain was these contours. All of those little brown lines are contours, which are technically lines of constant elevation. There are 4-foot increments here in these contours, which when I started this project was the most detailed terrain information available in this area. There has since been more advanced digital data, but it was the best at the time. And it also has exquisite detail. The Army men who surveyed and created this map used different symbols for pine trees, hardwood trees, orchards. The famous peach orchard looks like little broccoli standing in regular rows. Fence lines, footpaths, houses, whether fences were made of stone or wood, it's extraordinarily detailed, so it's an exceptional source. I traced the contours, there being no extraction system at the time that I could use digitally, but it was also a chance to get that topography sort of inside my skin. I spent one summer doing that. And then stitching those lines together, assigning them digital values for elevation, you can then ask the GIS computer program to create a digital terrain surface, which is a model, it's artificial, but here it is, which is the best historically correct model of the terrain that I could create at that time. So we know this battle, it's the most famously written about battle, there are more movies about Gettysburg than any other, but I thought there was a question that we had not yet answered, which was, what could Lee see at Gettysburg, and how might that have influenced his decisions, given the constraint of his not having a good map to work with, or very good scouting information. The scouts completely let him down in this battle. So what I've done over the years in various iterations, and most recently in the map with the Smithsonian that Jeff mentioned, is use those contours and that digital terrain and troop position maps, which I'll show you that detail in a moment, to try to replay the battle and to use a GIS function called viewshed analysis to answer that question, what could Lee see? Viewshed analysis allows you to put yourself digitally in someone's shoes and ask the computer to tell you what can the person see from here and what can they not see, because the computer knows the shape of the terrain and what would block or enable views. So putting Lee down at the bottom of the battlefield, this is the morning of the 3rd day, when he's deciding whether to launch what becomes known as Pickett's charge. We know that about 8 o'clock in the morning he comes down to this ridgeline with a couple of his lieutenants with his binoculars, and he's looking northeast at an angle. Well, he would have scanned the whole horizon, but the area of interest is what's within this red cone, where he knew that federal troops were massing. And here I'll just show you, surrounded by that black oval, on that morning when he was seeing like this. Within that oval those were all of the troops who were there at that time. So what is this showing? It shows him the famous weak center, the Union line in blue. That is the weak center of a very long Union line of defense on slightly elevated ground that Lee decides he's going to attack. He's going to concentrate 15,000 to 18,000 men in a powerful attack on that weak center, bust through the line and break up the Union defense. But notice in this viewshed image, what is in shadow? In the dark area, on the right side of the map, are massed Union troops who had come up from Washington overnight that his scouts did not tell him about. In blue, thousands of men whose presence he didn't see, he could not have physically seen from where he was. And in the northeastern part of the battlefield, particularly sort of just south of those red Confederate troops massed around a hill, even more men who were not immediately engaged. So the cannonade happens in the morning, then in the afternoon, Lee launches the attack. What he does not count on and was completely surprised by was how quickly the Union commanders were able to pull up those unseen reinforcements to that weak center and mass them there. And it is the massing of Union defense that holds the Confederate wave, as it's described, and then pushes it back. And that is Lee's defeat at at Gettysburg. Now, it's not that this is the only explanation. More men come in from the eastern part of the battlefield. The Confederates keep attacking, but the resistance is too strong, and they are pushed away. And Lee then famously walks out among them to say, I'm sorry, it is all my fault. And I think he was right. The last images I'm showing you are from work that I was delighted to benefit from by a very gifted 3D animator and illustrator named Tim Montagnol, who worked with a cartographic company who helped me create the website. And this is his realization digitally of that historical map I showed you, plus the elevation values. So we now have a digital terrain. This is a different viewpoint, not Lee's, but this is the viewpoint of Governor Kemble Warren. He's the hero from, it's Joshua Chamberlain who's the hero. Governor Kemble Warren is a high commander who's called up to the ridgeline on Little Round Top when scouts report that the Confederates are approaching. You can see the Confederates on the ridgeline in the left-hand part of this image, and he calls in reinforcements. Then there's the famous engagement, the attack on Little Round Top. It's the focus of the movie with Jeff Bridges. Jeff Bridges plays Joshua Chamberlain, who goes on to become the president of Bowdoin College in Maine, who calls his men together to defend to the end, and they finally do a big wheeling motion and drive off the men from Alabama and Texas, and they win the day by defending the federal flank. What this particular visual, though, does for me is that it begins, it dangerously skirts on verisimilitude, which can make one uneasy. But I think it really helps one, and maybe especially helps students, see what this landscape was like and imagine the battle in a somewhat more vivid way that may help them find a new interest in the Civil War. What I hope I've suggested to you is that using the digital method of GIS and cartography and 3D rendering and other approaches can help one investigate questions that otherwise are elusive or might not even occur to you in the first place. And I am absolutely confident, after what I've seen here at Jeff's lab, that University of Saskatchewan is going to become a center for this kind of creative work. I think it actually is already. And with that, I'll thank you very much for your attention.